June 15, 1991, Asheville, North Carolina. A 16-year-old girl named Emily Carter left her summer job at a local diner and started the short walk home. It should have taken less than 10 minutes. She never made it. By morning, her backpack was found on a wooded trail just blocks from her house. Inside were her wallet, keys, and school notebook. Nearby lay a single shoe and a hair scrunchie. But Emily was gone. Police launched a full search. Dogs, helicopters, and volunteers scoured the woods. Flyers covered storefronts. Local news crews turned the disappearance into headlines. Emily's mother appeared on television, pleading for answers. She would never run away. Someone took her leads came quickly. A truck driver reported seeing a man force a girl into a dark pickup truck around 9:45 that night. Tire tracks were cast from the dirt. A broken wristwatch was bagged as evidence. Under Emily's fingernails, investigators found male DNA, too small to identify in 1991. Attention shifted to two suspects. Michael Hale, Emily's boyfriend, had argued with her just days before. His alibi for that night didn't add up. Ray Briggs, a neighbor with a criminal past, was spotted near the woods. Both denied involvement. Both were investigated. But without enough evidence, the case collapsed. By 1993, Emily's disappearance was marked as a cold case. For years, her family kept her bedroom untouched. Candlelight vigils were held every June. Asheville parents warned their children not to walk home alone. Hope lingered, but answers never came. Then, in 1997, hikers near the French Broad River stumbled across human remains. Torn clothing and jewelry confirmed what many feared. Emily had been there all along. Her disappearance had turned into discovery, but not into justice. The cause of death remained uncertain, and the trail went cold once again. For nearly 3 decades, the truth hid in silence. Until new science, new detectives, and a single strand of DNA finally brought the case back to life. Stay with us as we uncover the long road from Emily Carter's disappearance. April 12, 2008, Clearwater, Florida. A warm spring evening. Tourist season alive with noise and movement. Crowds filled the beaches, the restaurants, the late-night streets. For most, it was an ordinary Saturday. But for one family, it would become the night that changed everything. Rachel Monroe was 20 years old, a marine biology student at the University of South Florida. Disciplined, serious about her future, and focused on finishing her degree. That Saturday, she worked a late shift at a small cafe not far from campus. Her co-workers remembered her leaving at 10:15 p.m. They said she looked tired, but she smiled, waved goodbye, and walked to her silver sedan in the parking lot. Rachel had a routine. After work, she usually drove straight back to her dorm, a short 15-minute ride. She often called her mother, Linda, during the drive. Just a simple check-in, something she did most nights. But on April 12th, that call never came. At 10:30 p.m., a security camera from a nearby convenience store caught her car driving toward Honeymoon Island. The footage was clear. One driver, no passengers. The timestamp showed 10:32. That was the last confirmed sighting of Rachel Monroe alive. When she didn't show up at her dorm, no one thought much of it at first. Maybe she stayed with a friend. Maybe she was studying late somewhere. But by the next morning, her professors noticed she was missing from class. Friends couldn't reach her. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Her mother, Linda, called over and over. No answer. By noon on April 13th, panic replaced doubt. Linda Monroe reported her daughter missing to Clearwater Police. That same evening, officers searching the area found Rachel's car at Honeymoon Island State Park. It was parked near the entrance, angled slightly across the line, as if stopped in a hurry. The driver's door hung ajar. Inside the ignition, the keys still dangled. On the passenger seat sat her canvas tote filled with textbooks and a field notebook from class. Nothing appeared stolen. But what lay outside? Within hours, word of Rachel's disappearance spread across Clearwater. Local news stations led with the story. Flyers were printed and taped to shop windows. Students from the University of South Florida gathered in groups, whispering, calling each other, asking if anyone had seen her. Neighbors drove by Honeymoon Island, staring at the police tape, shocked that violence could erupt in such a familiar place. The Monroe family rushed to the park, only to be blocked at the entrance. Reporters snapped photos as Linda pleaded with officers for information. The image of a mother searching for answers made the evening news. By midnight, candlelight vigils were already forming near the shoreline. Rachel's professors and classmates held hands, praying for her safe return. Strangers from Clearwater and Dunedin joined them. Honeymoon Island, usually filled with tourists, became a gathering place of fear and hope. Detectives canvassed the area through the night. They interviewed joggers, dog walkers, and fishermen who had been at the park on April 12th. Some remembered nothing unusual. Others recalled faint shouting near the lot. One man claimed he saw a silver sedan drive in around 10:30, but didn't notice it leave. Every piece of testimony only deepened the sense of urgency. Rachel had not walked away. She had been taken. The first 24 hours passed, then the next. No trace of Rachel herself, only the car, the tote, the footprints, and the torn jeans with blood. By then, Clearwater Police had launched a full missing person investigation. The Monroe family went on television, pleading with anyone who knew something to step forward. But the trail that began on April 12th was already growing cold. The night Rachel Monroe disappeared became the starting point of one of Florida's most haunting cold cases. What began with a missing student and a deserted car would unravel over years, through suspects, dead ends, and finally, the shocking truth hidden in DNA evidence. Stay with us, because in the next part, we follow the early investigation, the first suspect, and the mistakes that shaped this case for more than a decade. The first 48 hours after Rachel Monroe vanished were. Ethan was 22 years old, only 2 years older than Rachel. He had been her boyfriend for nearly 2 years. They broke up 3 months before she disappeared. Friends described the breakup as messy. Rachel had shifted her attention toward her studies and future. Ethan, on the other hand, preferred nights out, parties, and a lifestyle she no longer wanted to be part of. Their paths diverged, and by January 2008, the relationship had ended. That alone might not have been enough to raise red flags, but what pushed investigators further was a report that surfaced in the days after Rachel went missing. A student at the University of South Florida told police that he had seen Rachel and Ethan arguing outside a student center only a week before April 12th. The argument was described as heated, loud enough to draw attention. The witness remembered Rachel storming away, visibly upset. For investigators under immense pressure to deliver answers, the image of a jealous ex-boyfriend confronting a young woman who then disappears was impossible to ignore. Within days of the disappearance, Ethan Clark was brought into the station for questioning. Detectives pressed him hard, hoping to crack the case quickly. Ethan denied any involvement. He said he had not spoken to Rachel since their breakup and claimed he spent the night of April 12th at home with his stepfather. He stuck to his story even as questions grew sharper. But when police followed up on his alibi, the cracks began to show. Ethan's stepfather confirmed he was home that evening, but his timeline shifted in subtle ways. At first, he said Ethan was there by 9 o'clock. Later, he adjusted that to closer to 10 o'clock. Investigators noticed the inconsistencies and grew more suspicious. In cases like this, a shaky alibi is often enough to keep someone under the microscope. Outside the police station, the pressure built. Word spread through Clearwater that Ethan was the main suspect. Neighbors whispered. Online message boards lit up with speculation. Some painted him as the angry ex-boyfriend who couldn't let go. Others claimed they had always felt something was off about him. His name became tied to Rachel's disappearance almost immediately. For weeks, the Florida State Crime Lab worked the samples. It was the most anticipated result of the early investigation. Detectives, the Monroe family, and the entire community waited. If the DNA matched Ethan, the case could move forward. But when the results finally arrived, they delivered a shock. There was no match. The male DNA recovered from Rachel's torn jeans did not belong to Ethan Clark. His fingerprints, car, and apartment also showed nothing suspicious. For investigators, it was a major blow. The strongest lead had collapsed. Ethan, who had carried the weight of suspicion, was officially cleared. But outside the walls of the police department, clearance on paper did little to erase the shadow. The community had already made up its mind. To them, Ethan had been the first and obvious suspect. And even when he was no longer considered a person of interest, whispers continued. Some locals said maybe the labs made a mistake. Others believed he was involved somehow, even if the police couldn't prove it. The stigma followed him everywhere. Friends distanced themselves. Employers hesitated. Neighbors gave cold stares. For Ethan, life in Clearwater became unbearable. He eventually moved away, seeking to escape the constant judgment and online speculation that clung to him. Detectives later described his situation as a classic case of first suspect syndrome. It happens in many high-profile disappearances. Investigators, facing pressure from the public and media, often focus too quickly on the most visible or emotionally charged suspect, usually an ex-partner, close relative, or friend. Even when evidence clears them, the label sticks. The damage is lasting. In Rachel's case, the heavy focus on Ethan may have cost investigators valuable time. While they zeroed in on him, broader leads were not fully explored. Witness canvases slowed. Other potential suspects remained in the background. For months, resources were consumed, testing, questioning, and re-questioning Ethan, only to end with nothing. As the investigation lost momentum, frustration spread. Rachel's family felt stuck between grief and anger. They had no answers, no suspects, and no direction. The community in Clearwater, April 2008, ended with no resolution. The police had eliminated their prime suspect, but had nothing to replace him. Rachel was still missing. Her car and torn jeans the only evidence left behind. The Monroe family was left waiting for answers that never came. As summer turned into fall, the case slowed further. Leads dried up. Public interest shifted to other headlines. But for the Monroe family and for Ethan Clark, the effects of those first weeks never faded. Rachel was still gone. Ethan's reputation was in ruins. and the investigation, stripped of direction, was already at risk of going cold. The story of Ethan Clark's involvement, or rather his lack of involvement, shows the challenges of these cases. It shows how quickly investigators can narrow their vision, how rapidly a community can attach guilt, and how easily time can slip away while the truth remains hidden. What no one knew in 2008 was that the real suspect was much closer than anyone realized. He wasn't an ex-boyfriend or a jealous acquaintance. He was someone who appeared harmless, even helpful. Someone who blended into the search for Rachel, who stood among those demanding answers. His name would not surface until 15 years later. But before that breakthrough, the Monroe family and the people of Clearwater endured years of silence. And Rachel's file joined the growing stack of cold cases, where hope is suspended and justice waits. Stay with us. In the next part, we see how the Monroe family and their community responded to the silence, how grief and suspicion took hold, and how Rachel's case became another file gathering dust. The disappearance of Rachel Monroe left the Monroe family shattered. Her mother Linda collapsed under the weight of grief, unable to keep hope alive. Her father Thomas forced himself into the role of spokesperson. He handled police updates, stood in front of news cameras, and tried to represent the family when words barely came. Their younger son Jason watched the household change overnight. Within a week, the community gathered. A candlelight vigil was held at Honeymoon Island, the same place where Rachel's car had been found. Dozens of classmates. Local media covered every development during the first month. News anchors stood outside Honeymoon Island, repeating the facts. Rachel's picture stayed on the evening broadcast. National outlets picked up the case for a short while, showing her face across the country. But soon, attention drifted. Other stories took over. And Rachel's name disappeared from national headlines. When media coverage faded, rumors filled the silence. Online forums speculated endlessly. Neighborhood gossip circled back to Ethan Clark, even though police had already cleared him. Some insisted the ex-boyfriend must be guilty. Others speculated about strangers, tourists, even theories about traffickers. None of it was backed by evidence, but the speculation spread faster than the facts. At home, the Monroes broke under the pressure. Linda fell into depression. She rarely left the house. Thomas grew frustrated with the lack of progress from investigators. Jason, just a teenager, faced whispers at school about his sister. Some classmates asked cruel questions. Others simply avoided him. The case that began with the loss of a daughter now reached every corner of the family's life. The community itself was changing. Clearwater, once known for calm beaches and a sense of safety, was shaken. Families started locking doors more tightly. Neighbors watched each other more closely. Trust eroded. Some people stopped going to Honeymoon Island altogether, the place now marked by fear. Meanwhile, the investigation lost steam. 6 months passed. Detectives had followed tips, collected statements, and tested evidence, but no arrests were made. The torn jeans, the footprints, and the car abandoned with the keys in the ignition, all of it led nowhere. The file grew thicker, but nothing pointed to a suspect. By late 2008, investigators delivered the news the Monroes feared most. Rachel's disappearance was now classified as a cold case. The label hit the family like another blow. Cold meant resources would shrink. Cold meant few investigators. Cold meant waiting, with no timeline, no guarantees. Thomas and Linda refused to stay silent. They wrote letters to state officials, to federal agencies, to... After the first anniversary, major media outlets moved on. Only local newspapers printed short blurbs. Another year without answers. Families still waiting for closure. The stories were brief, buried in the back pages. Rachel Monroe's case became one more unsolved file in Florida, gathering dust. For the Monroe family, life became a cycle of waiting. They lived with constant uncertainty, not knowing where Rachel was or what had happened in those final moments. Each phone call from a detective raised hope, but each update ended in disappointment. The silence stretched into years. Rachel's name faded from television, but her family refused to let her memory disappear. Clearwater carried the weight of her case too. But as time passed, even the community began to accept that Rachel's disappearance had become part of the long list of unanswered tragedies. Rachel Monroe was more than a missing person on a flyer. She was a reminder of how quickly life can fracture, how easily an investigation can stall, and how a family can be left waiting for justice that never comes. Stay with us. In the next part, we return 15 years later, when a new tool, genetic genealogy, finally cracks open Rachel's case and reveals the man who had been hiding in plain sight all along. By 2023, the disappearance of Rachel Monroe had sat unsolved for 15 years. Her name was buried deep in Florida's cold case files, another folder in a cabinet filled with unanswered questions. For years, detectives had moved on, reassigned to newer cases. Families of the missing lived in silence, holding on to anniversaries and hoping that someday something would change. That change came with a new statewide program. Florida invested in advanced genetic genealogy, a tool already used in other states to crack cases once thought impossible. Forensic units received funding to revisit old evidence, no matter how small or degraded. Every case was given another chance. Rachel's file was pulled out again. Detectives scanned through the familiar pages. Photographs of her silver sedan, reports about Honeymoon Island, witness statements, and crime scene evidence. They paused on one. Within weeks, the system returned a match. Not a direct suspect, but a distant cousin living in Tennessee. Genealogists were brought in to do what detectives could not. They began the painstaking process of building family trees, tracing branches backward through census records, birth certificates, marriage licenses, and obituaries. Each branch extended, split, and narrowed until a clearer picture formed. The tree pointed back toward Clearwater. At the center of it was one man, Mark Doyle. 52 years old, a local HVAC repairman, married once, divorced, with no major criminal history. Doyle had lived just blocks from the Monroe family at the time of Rachel's disappearance. He worked in homes across the area, often fixing air conditioners or attackers. He blended into the background of the community, unnoticed and unremarkable. Detectives ran a background check. They found no violent record, only minor infractions. On paper, he looked harmless, but the family tree didn't lie. His DNA lined up with the partial match. And then came the detail that made investigators freeze. Back in 2008, when search parties were organized to find Rachel, Mark Doyle had been there. He had joined volunteers combing through wooded trails. He had handed out flyers with Rachel's picture. He had stood among grieving neighbors, presenting himself as part of the effort to bring her home. His presence had been seen as supportive, never suspicious. Now, 15 years later, it looked different. Detectives launched quiet surveillance. They followed Doyle's daily movements, careful not to alert him. They tracked his routes to job sites, his grocery runs, his routine stops. What they needed was simple but critical: a discarded item carrying his DNA. Weeks passed before the opportunity came. Doyle bought a soda on his lunch break. After finishing, he tossed the empty can into a public trash bin outside a gas station. Investigators retrieved it within minutes. The can was rushed to the lab. The test results came back conclusive. The DNA on the soda can matched perfectly. The revelation shocked those who remembered the early days of the search. Mark Doyle had walked among them, pretending to help. He had listened to conversations, watched the family grieve, and even accepted thanks from Linda Monroe for volunteering. All while knowing exactly what had happened to Rachel. In July 2023, the investigation shifted from quiet surveillance to preparation for arrest. Detectives built their case carefully. The genealogy trail, the family tree, the surveillance, the soda can. All of it stacked into a file that prosecutors believed could stand in court. There would be no room for doubt. 15 years after Rachel's disappearance, her case was no longer cold. The breakthrough with genetic genealogy had turned it red hot again. The name Mark Doyle moved from obscurity to the center of a murder investigation. For the Monroe family, it was a moment of truth. The answers they had begged for, written letters for, held vigils for, were finally coming. But the cost of waiting 15 years could never be erased. What began with a torn piece of denim and a few drops of blood in 2008 ended with a discarded soda can in 2023. Two small pieces of evidence, connected across time by science, finally told the story investigators had been chasing. And what that story revealed was simple but devastating. Rachel's killer had been hiding in plain sight. Stay with us. In the next part, we see what happened when police knocked on Mark Doyle's door, how the arrest unfolded, and how a community reacted when they learned the man they once trusted was the very one they feared. July 14th, 2023. The case of Rachel Monroe took a turn no one in Clearwater thought they would ever see. At dawn, detectives and deputies surrounded a modest home on a quiet street. Neighbors woke to the sound of car doors slamming, radios buzzing, and the sharp command of officers preparing to make an arrest. For 15 years, Rachel's disappearance had been an open wound in the community. That morning, the name at the center of it was finally spoken out. The Monroe family's reaction was immediate and emotional. For years, Linda Monroe had replayed the details of that spring night in 2008, begging for answers. She remembered standing at vigils, thanking the volunteers who joined the search. Among them was Mark Doyle. He had shaken her hand. He had promised to help bring Rachel home. Learning now that the man she once thanked was the very suspect behind Rachel's disappearance left her crushed. It feels like betrayal layered on top of grief, she told reporters later. Clearwater itself erupted in shock. People who had once trusted Doyle struggled to reconcile the man they knew with the man police described. For years he had blended into their lives, fixing heaters, making small talk, living quietly just blocks from where Rachel's car was found. Now they had to accept that he had walked free, undetected, while the Monroe family suffered in silence. Public anger grew quickly. Many residents demanded answers about how Doyle had escaped suspicion for so long. He lived near the Monroes. He had been part of the search parties. He had access to Honeymoon Island, like anyone in the area. How was it possible that detectives had not looked harder at him in 2008? Commentators pointed to flaws in the early investigation: the narrow focus on Ethan Clark, the failure to fully vet neighbors, the decision to label the case cold after only 6 months. The debate spilled into talk shows and local papers. Had law enforcement been too quick to chase the most obvious suspect while the real one stood nearby unnoticed? Some officers defended their work, explaining that DNA technology in 2008 wasn't advanced enough to identify Doyle. Others admitted privately that tunnel vision on the ex-boyfriend cost them valuable time. The arrest ignited a media frenzy. News crews filled Clearwater's streets, broadcasting from Honeymoon Island, replaying old footage of the original search. National headlines read, "Cold case solved by DNA after 15 years." Commentators highlighted how ordinary Doyle had appeared and how chilling it was that someone so unremarkable could commit such a crime. Within the community, emotions divided. Some residents admitted to feeling guilty for never suspecting Doyle, for letting him move so freely among them. Others felt relief, even gratitude, that at last the truth had surfaced. The arrest was not closure, but it was a step. For many, it was proof that persistence, combined with new technology, could finally bring results. Law enforcement held a press conference outlining the case. They emphasized that the DNA match was decisive, that genetic genealogy had been the breakthrough. They explained how the torn denim jeans from 2008 and a discarded soda can from 2023 connected Doyle beyond any doubt. For investigators, it was validation after years of frustration. They told the Monroe family and the world that this time justice would not slip away. The ripple effects spread beyond Clearwater. Families across Florida who had their own missing loved ones began calling cold case units, asking if genealogy testing could be applied to their files. Advocacy groups praised the science, calling it the future of cold case investigation. Detectives in other counties reviewed their evidence lockers, searching for samples once dismissed as too small or too degraded. Rachel's case became an example of what was possible when technology was finally given a second chance. But alongside the progress came anger. Questions about missed opportunities filled the air. Why had Doyle's presence at vigils, his proximity to the Monroe home, not triggered deeper scrutiny in 2008? How many years could have been saved if the investigation had cast a wider net? The arrest did not only bring shock, it brought accountability. For the Monroes, the arrest was another chapter of grief. Relief that a suspect was caught was paired with the pain of knowing Rachel had been gone all along. Linda Monroe spoke softly at a vigil days after Doyle's arrest. "He stood with us while we searched. He looked me in the eye and told me he hoped Rachel would come home. And the whole time, he knew Clearwater was left reeling. The mask of normalcy had shattered. The man who repaired homes, waved at neighbors, and offered to help with flyers was now charged with first-degree murder." His arrest forced everyone to confront a disturbing truth. Killers don't always look like villains. Sometimes they look like the people we trust. The shock waves from that July morning would not fade quickly. The case of Rachel Monroe was no longer an unsolved mystery. It was now a story about betrayal, community blindness, and the long road to justice. And as the trial loomed, Clearwater braced for more revelations, determined that this time the truth would not slip through their fingers. Stay with us. In the next part, we step into the interrogation room, where Mark Doyle's confession reveals the final moments of Rachel Monroe's life, and how the evidence matched his words in chilling detail. After his arrest in July 2023, Mark Doyle was brought into an interrogation room. At first, he said nothing. He avoided eye contact, leaned back in his chair, and gave short answers. Detectives pressed him with questions, but Doyle kept circling back to denials. The silence stretched for hours. What finally broke him was the evidence. Investigators laid out the DNA results on the table. The match was perfect. His DNA was under Rachel Monroe's fingernails, and it was on the torn denim jeans recovered near her abandoned car. There was no way out. Doyle sighed, shifted in his chair, and began to talk. He admitted that on the night of April 12, 2008, he had been drinking heavily. Alone and restless, he decided to drive to Honeymoon Island. He told detectives he went there often when he wanted to clear his head. That night his mind was clouded with alcohol. His judgment was already broken. At the parking lot he noticed Rachel. She had just finished her late shift at the cafe and pulled into the lot. Doyle said she was locking her car door when he saw her. He approached, trying to strike up a conversation. He offered to walk with her along the beach. Rachel, tired and cautious, refused. She told him she wasn't interested and turned away. Doyle said he felt embarrassed. He described it as a moment that hit his pride. Fueled by alcohol and anger, he stepped in front of Rachel, blocking her path. When she tried to move around him, he grabbed her arm. That was when everything spiraled. Rachel fought back immediately. She pulled away, raising her voice, demanding that he let go. Doyle struck her across the face, hard enough to knock her off balance. She fell onto the sand, and the struggle began. Detectives listened as Doyle described the scene in chilling detail. Rachel kicked, clawed, and screamed. He dragged her further away from the car, trying to control her. The chaotic footprints investigators documented in 2008 matched the scene Doyle now described. He admitted that she scratched at his arms and face. More importantly, she clawed at his hands as he closed them around her neck. That desperate fight was what left his DNA under her fingernails. Doyle said the fight was quick but violent. In his drunken state, he panicked. He claimed he snapped, that he didn't plan anything, that it was a sudden loss of control. But his description showed intent. He held her down and strangled her until she stopped moving. As he spoke, detectives took notes. The details matched perfectly with the evidence from 2008. The torn jeans fragment found near the car? Doyle explained that during the struggle, Rachel's jeans ripped. He admitted he discarded the bloody piece near the dunes. That evidence had been preserved for 15 years, waiting for the day technology could identify him. When Rachel stopped moving, Doyle said he froze. He looked at her body, terrified by what he had done. Instead of calling for help, he dragged her toward the sand dunes. He tried to hide her quickly, covering her with brush and leaving her there. He said he thought no one would find her, that the tide or wildlife would erase the evidence. He admitted throwing away other pieces of evidence: fabric, personal items, burying them in the sand. Investigators knew this matched what they had recovered years earlier. The crime scene had always suggested a struggle and a hasty attempt to conceal it. Doyle's words now filled in the blanks. But what struck detectives most was his tone. He spoke without emotion, as if describing a simple incident rather than the end of a young woman's life. He called it a mistake and a moment of losing control. He never used the word sorry. He never expressed regret. Even when pressed directly, asked if he felt remorse, he shrugged and repeated that it was something that got out of hand. For the Monroe family, the confession was like reopening the wound all over again. Detectives sat down with Linda Monroe to share what Doyle had admitted. She collapsed, unable to comprehend that the man she had once thanked for joining search efforts was the same man who had killed her daughter. Family members described the moment as devastating, worse even than the years of silence, because now they knew exactly what had happened in Rachel's final moments. The details Doyle gave lined up with everything. Commentators pointed out how Doyle's lack of emotion revealed his character. He had lived freely, working jobs, chatting with neighbors, attending community events, all while carrying the knowledge of what he had done. And even when finally confronted, he refused to show guilt. The confession closed a chapter in the investigation, but it opened another in the community. People began to question everything. If Doyle could hide for so long, who else might be living among them with secrets? How many other families were waiting for answers that could be found only with new technology? For detectives, Doyle's words confirmed what they had suspected since the DNA match. Rachel had fought for her life. She had resisted, left scratches, and left behind the evidence that would one day identify her attacker. The struggle she put up in her last moments ensured that the case would not remain unsolved forever. In the interrogation room, Doyle leaned back after finishing his account. He looked drained, not from guilt but from being caught. He offered no further detail about where he left Rachel's body. He said he couldn't remember. Investigators didn't believe him, but his silence on that point remained. The absence of a recovered body would later become a focal point in the trial. For now, though, his confession was enough. It matched the evidence. It confirmed the crime. And it gave the Monroe family the truth they had been denied for 15 years. But the truth came with a heavy cost. Hearing how Rachel had been approached, how she had fought, how she had been silenced, shattered her family again. Linda Monroe nearly collapsed when detectives read the transcript aloud. She had spent years replaying possibilities in her mind. Now, she had to live with the reality. The public response was swift. Calls for reform grew louder. People demanded stronger cold case units, better preservation of evidence, and wider use of genetic genealogy. They pointed to Doyle's confession as proof that justice delayed was not justice denied, but also as a reminder of how long families can suffer when cases are left unsolved. Mark Doyle's confession did not bring closure. It brought clarity. It showed exactly what happened on that spring night in 2008. It revealed how quickly an ordinary evening could turn violent, and it forced Clearwater to reckon with the fact that the killer had been among them all along. As Doyle was led back to his cell, the case moved forward toward trial. His words would become central evidence. His cold tone would become part of the story the prosecution told to the jury. And Rachel Monroe's family, though devastated, now carried the truth with them into the next fight. For justice, in court. Stay with us. In the next part, we step outside the interrogation room and into the streets of Clearwater, where outrage turned to action, and the Monroe case became the center of a larger call for reform. When Mark Doyle's confession became public, Clearwater erupted. The crime had been solved on paper, but the emotions were only beginning. Crowds gathered outside the courthouse and the police station, holding signs and demanding accountability. People who had lived in silence for years now shouted together. The words on their banners told the story. "Justice delayed is justice denied." The phrase spread fast, painted on posters, printed on t-shirts, echoed on social media, and repeated at vigils. For a town that had waited 15 years for answers, the message captured their frustration. At the University of South Florida, where Rachel Monroe had studied marine biology, students organized a march through campus. Hundreds walked with candles and banners calling on state leaders to fund stronger cold case units. Some carried Rachel's picture. Others carried signs with the names of other missing Floridians. They weren't just remembering Rachel. They were demanding change so no other case would take this long. Experts also stepped forward. Forensic scientists appeared on national broadcasts, praising the power of journalists, and commentators went further. They asked why Doyle, a neighbor who lived blocks away from the Monroe family and even joined search parties, had escaped deeper scrutiny. Some called it tunnel vision. Detectives had focused too heavily on Ethan Clark, the ex-boyfriend, while ignoring other obvious leads. Others blamed funding shortages, saying local departments simply lacked the resources to fully investigate every angle. Whatever the reason, the failure haunted Clearwater. For the Monroe family, the confession reopened wounds that had never truly closed. Thomas and Linda Monroe stood in front of cameras, voices breaking as they called for reform. They said if evidence had been better preserved, if modern testing had been applied sooner, their family would not have had to wait more than a decade. Their grief turned into advocacy. They urged lawmakers to ensure no other family lived through the same delay. The debate stretched far beyond Clearwater. Across the country, the Monroe case fueled arguments over DNA databases. One side demanded broader access, saying genetic genealogy had solved dozens of cold cases and saved families from endless waiting. The other side raised alarms about privacy, worried that personal data could be misused. Town halls, news panels, and online forums turned the Monroe case into a flashpoint in a larger national conflict. National media kept the spotlight bright. CNN, NBC, and ABC aired special reports comparing Rachel's case to others solved by genealogy. They showed side-by-side examples of how the same science had delivered justice in cases thought dead for decades. Rachel Monroe's name was no longer just local news. It was now a symbol of both success and failure. Success in how the case was solved, and failure in how long it had taken. Politicians could not ignore the momentum. Florida lawmakers received thousands of letters and emails from citizens demanding change. People asked for larger cold case budgets, stricter rules on preserving evidence, and statewide standards for applying genealogy testing. The Monroe case became a centerpiece in legislative hearings. Community groups also mobilized. Nonprofits focused on missing persons began fundraising for new DNA testing equipment. Victim advocacy organizations. By late 2023, Florida's state capital, Tallahassee, hosted multiple hearings and community forums. Lawmakers invited forensic experts, families of victims, and civil rights advocates to testify. Rachel's story was repeated again and again, not just as a tragedy, but as a lesson. The case had shown what technology could achieve and what could happen when evidence sat ignored for too long. The impact reached beyond Florida. Other states watched closely. Attorneys general and governors pointed to Florida as an example of how a single case could drive reform. Cold case detectives across the country reviewed their shelves, asking if the samples sitting in evidence rooms could be retested with the same methods. For Clearwater, the outrage became something more lasting. Vigils turned into rallies. Petitions turned into policy proposals. What began with a family searching for answers had grown into a movement demanding systemic change. The Monroe family remained at the center of it all. Linda, once broken by grief, now stood at podiums telling lawmakers and communities why reform was necessary. Thomas repeated the same message in interviews. 15 years was too long. If we had better tools sooner, Rachel's case would not have been cold. Clearwater's anger had become Florida's call to action, and soon it would reach the courtroom where Mark Doyle's trial was set to begin. The community wanted not only a guilty verdict, but proof that the system had finally learned from its mistakes. Stay with us. In the next part, we enter the trial, where DNA evidence, a chilling confession, and 15 years of waiting all collide in a packed courtroom. What do you think? Was the system finally ready to deliver justice? Share your thoughts and follow along for Part 8. The trial of Mark Doyle began in early 2024 inside the Pinellas County Courthouse. It was a case that Clearwater had waited 15 years to see reach this moment. The courtroom was packed, reporters filling rows with notepads and cameras, locals clutching seats, and the Monroe family sitting in the front. The weight of years hung in the air. Witnesses were called to establish the chain of evidence. Detectives who had worked the case in 2008 described how they had secured Rachel's car, the torn denim jeans, and the blood samples. Crime scene photos were displayed on screens for the jury, Rachel's silver sedan sitting in the parking lot with the door ajar, the canvas tote bag still inside, the jeans fragment stained with blood lying in the sand. Next came the investigators from 2023, who explained how those same items had been re-examined using advanced genetic genealogy. They described uploading the profile to a public database, the partial match to a distant cousin, and the painstaking family tree that led them to Doyle. One detective explained how they recovered DNA from a soda can Doyle discarded. The result came back as a perfect match to the samples found under Rachel's fingernails. The courtroom listened in silence as the detective stated firmly, "The odds of this DNA belonging to anyone else are astronomically low." The evidence was then laid out before the jury. Charts displayed the DNA profile. Forensic experts explained the science in clear terms. They emphasized that the profile from Rachel's fingernails and the discarded can were identical. When combined with the torn jeans and the confession, they argued, there was no reasonable doubt. The defense countered, but their strategy was strained. Doyle's attorneys claimed his confession had been coerced, that detectives had pushed him for hours until he gave them the story they wanted. They pointed out that Rachel's body had never been recovered, arguing that without it, the state could not prove beyond doubt how she died. They argued that after 15 years, evidence could be contaminated or unreliable. They urged the jury to be cautious about convicting based on what they called unproven science. But the prosecution was ready for those points. Their experts testified that the DNA samples had been carefully preserved, sealed, and logged. They explained that genetic genealogy had now been used in courts across the country and was accepted as reliable science. They reminded the jury that Doyle's confession had contained details only the killer could know: the location of the torn jeans. When closing arguments came, the tension was overwhelming. The prosecution addressed the jury one final time. "DNA does not lie," the prosecutor said. "Rachel Monroe, in her last moments, fought back. She left the evidence that brought us here today. Mark Doyle can deny. He can remain silent. But the science, the confession, and the facts tell the truth." The defense delivered their own closing. They warned the jury of setting a dangerous precedent by convicting a man without a body. They insisted Doyle's confession had been manipulated and asked the jurors to consider whether doubt remained. The jury was dismissed to deliberate. Hours passed. Outside the courthouse, crowds gathered, holding signs and waiting for word. Inside, the Monroe family sat in silence, waiting for the door to open again. Late that evening, the jury returned. The courtroom filled once more, every seat taken, every eye fixed on the foreperson. The verdict was read: guilty of first-degree murder and guilty of kidnapping. The words landed like a release of breath the town had been holding for years. Mark Doyle stood as the judge prepared the sentence. He remained expressionless, hands clasped in front of him. The judge spoke clearly. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. Doyle gave no reaction. He did not apologize. He did not speak. The reaction around him was immediate. In the courtroom, sobs broke out. The Monroe family clung to one another, Linda crying into Thomas's shoulder. Outside, word spread quickly and the crowd erupted. Some wept. Others cheered, calling it justice at last. For Clearwater, it was the end of a chapter that had hung over the town since 2008. Reporters rushed to capture the moment. National outlets broadcast the verdict across the country. Commentators called it one of Florida's most significant cold case trials. They noted that the outcome confirmed the power of genetic genealogy and the importance of preserving evidence for future testing. The Monroe family stepped outside briefly to address the press. Through tears, Linda said, "Justice has come, but the pain will never leave." Stay with us. In the final part, we look at the legacy of this case, how Rachel Monroe's story changed her community, changed Florida, and changed the way cold cases are investigated across the country. And we ask, what lessons remain for the future? Clearwater slowly returned to a rhythm of normal life after the trial, but the scars of Rachel Monroe's disappearance never faded. People admitted that even years later they looked over their shoulders when walking at night. Parents told their children to stay cautious, and neighbors locked doors earlier than before. The town had its justice, but it also had a memory it could not erase. At the University of South Florida, where Rachel once studied marine biology, her name was given new meaning. The school announced the creation of the Rachel Monroe Marine Biology Scholarship. It was designed to help students pursue the same field Rachel had loved. Applications poured in. For those who received it, the scholarship became more than financial support. It became a reminder of a young woman whose life ended too soon, and a way for her passion to live on through others. The Monroe case also became part of professional training. Forensic programs across the country began teaching it as a model of how cold cases could be solved through genetic genealogy. Trainees studied how a torn piece of denim, once considered too degraded, eventually produced a DNA profile that identified a killer. In classrooms and seminars, Rachel's case was no longer just a tragedy. It was a turning point in the science of investigation. Florida lawmakers responded as well. The state expanded funding for cold case units, directing new resources to re-examine old evidence with modern technology. Hundreds of dormant files were pulled from storage. Samples that had sat untouched for decades were now candidates for fresh analysis. Officials promised that Rachel's story would not be repeated, that no case should be abandoned simply because the technology of the time was too limited. The impact reached families across the state. People who had once given up hope now called investigators again. Mothers and fathers with missing children asked for their cases to be reopened. Widows who had lived decades without answers stepped forward, pointing to the Monroe verdict as proof that justice could still come. At the dedication ceremony, Linda Monroe stood before the crowd. Her voice was steady but heavy. She said, "Rachel's dream lives on through others." She reminded those listening that her daughter had been more than a victim. She had been a student, a daughter, and a young woman with ambition. Linda's message was clear. Rachel's life had not been erased. Her story had become a guide for reform and a reminder to never give up on the pursuit of justice. For investigators, the lesson was equally powerful. The Monroe case underscored the importance of preserving evidence, no matter how small or how uncertain. A single fragment of denim, a smear of blood, a scrap of DNA. These details proved decisive years later. Detectives across the country began reinforcing policies to store and protect evidence indefinitely, ensuring that future technology could unlock its secrets. Media outlets described the trial and conviction as one of the most important cold case victories in Florida. Analysts said it reshaped how the public viewed justice in long unsolved crimes. It showed that cases once thought impossible to close could be resolved with persistence and innovation. Forensic experts called it a watershed moment, pushing lawmakers to invest in the science of genetic genealogy. In the years that followed, the Monroe case was often cited in debates about the balance between privacy and public safety. Critics of wide DNA use raised questions, but the overwhelming consensus was that the outcome justified the method. Families who had suffered in silence saw a new reason to press for answers. Rachel Monroe's name became a shorthand for the promise that time alone cannot erase truth. For Clearwater, Rachel's story was both a tragedy and a legacy. She was not only remembered as the victim of a crime, but as the reason reforms were made, evidence was preserved, and technology was embraced. Residents said she had become a symbol of persistence and hope, proving that justice could come even after years of darkness. The story of Rachel Monroe stands as a reminder. Justice may not come quickly, it may not come easily. But when evidence is preserved, when technology is used,